I'm John Nielson-Gammon with Texas A&M University, and I'm the Texas State Climatologist. Chair and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. As the Texas State Climatologist, it's my job to help the government and people of Texas make the best possible use of weather and climate information. Any opinions I express before you today are my own and are not intended to represent in any way the official position of the state of Texas. In 10 minutes, there's no way for me to do justice to the complexities of climate change and its impacts. Fortunately, there are many documents available that summarize scientific knowledge regarding climate change. Perhaps the most well-known are those from the IPCC, which are intended as a frame of reference for possible international agreements regarding man-made global warming, and as such, they're sort of a hybrid of scientific and political documents. At the national level, we have the National Climate Assessment, which is produced every 5 years, and the latest version is due out later this year. There's also a series of reports produced by the National Academy of Sciences called America's Climate Choices, which Professor Busby referred to. At the state level, there's a book called The Impact of Global Warming on Texas, which was published a couple years ago by the University of Texas Press. In all those documents, I can find things that I disagree with, but on the whole, they get things right. If you're interested in learning more, I suggest going directly to those resource documents rather than relying on the second-hand descriptions that are available from media stories, blogs, and commentaries by advocates of one position or another. In particular, I think the National Academy of Sciences report is spot on when it recommends a risk management approach to climate change. There are some things about climate change that we know, some things that we're pretty confident of, and some where we really have no idea. One thing that's clear to everybody is that we can no longer count on the climate staying the way it was. We have to allow for a broader range of possibilities than the last 100 years of climate data records alone would indicate. In my testimony today, I want to focus on those aspects of climate change that are especially relevant to international trade and relations. Uppermost in people's minds these days seems to be the ongoing Texas drought, which, if it continues through the summer, would, in my judgment, be the second worst drought on record statewide. And some are asking, is this the new normal? Is this what the climate of Texas is going to be like? Some good news on that front. The answer does seem to be no. Research that I did with colleagues at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration indicates that the intense 2011 drought and heat wave were primarily caused by La Nina sea surface temperature patterns combined with bad luck with the weather. Although most climate models project precipitation to decrease slightly in Texas, historically there's been a significant increase in precipitation over the past century. Also, we don't know whether we'll get more La Ninas in the future or fewer, so precipitation is still a question mark regarding climate change. It seems to me that natural variability will continue to dominate Texas's rainfall for the next several decades. Presently, both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans are in a phase that favors dry conditions in Texas, which is at least a partial explanation for the frequent droughts we've been experiencing this century. The last time these ocean conditions were in place was during the drought of the 1950s. These ocean patterns seem likely to continue for another decade or more. We may see a few more droughts, or the present drought may possibly last for several more years. Then at least comes hopefully an extended period of wetter conditions as the natural cycle goes back and forth, but then down the road will be more droughts. The fact remains that Texas is unusually susceptible to droughts simply by virtue of its geographical location and the climate influences it experiences.
Chairman Evans?
It's Nielson-Gammon, right?
That's right.
Dr. Nielson-Gammon, can you distinguish between, and without, I'm not asking you to take a political stance on this, but can you distinguish between, and you were talking right now about the 1950s drought and the relation between La Nina, effects and the ebb and flow of both the Pacific and the Atlantic. Based on your experience and your study, is that any different from what's going on, and what about our footprint with respect to how much greater the potential for the drought to be extended, or this new normal that we have to be used to compared to what was going on in the 50s? Because there's both a political and, I guess, scientific debate on whether those two things are this is just kind of the ebb and flow of the way things go over history, or how much our own footprint has to do with the changes, and are they exacerbated? I know that's a lot of questions and a lot of information, but do you kind of get where I'm going?
Sure. Well, we've got the meteorological conditions and the consequences. Of course, since the 1950s drought, we invested a great deal in reservoir building and so forth, and for a while our water supply was increasing much faster than our population. And then since about the 1980s, our population has been increasing much faster than the water supply. So right now we're basically back to the same place as we were in the 50s in terms of our vulnerability to drought. In terms of the drought itself, their treating records show the 1950s drought is not the worst that's been experienced historically. This drought has some of the same factors driving it. No telling right now whether this is going to be worse than the 50s drought or end sooner. The one factor meteorologically that's distinct about it is it's happening in the context of temperatures which have increased by a degree or two. So this drought has been warmer than the 50s drought. And that has consequences to greater water demand, reduced stream flow, reduced reservoir supplies, and higher salinities along the coast, because increased temperatures imply increased evaporation. So that's the distinction I would make.
Chairman Capriglione.
Thank you for coming here. I should probably turn this on. Thank you, Doctor. Hey, I wanted to ask a little bit more information. How do we calculate the temperature? I mean, I always hear about it's 1 degree warmer, 1 degree colder, or whatever, but what does that mean? Do we have temperature stations all over the U.S., all over the world? How do we do that calculation? And I guess my second question would be, how did we calculate it 100 years ago?
It depends on the geographical region. I'll answer for Texas and then expand. We have some historical temperature records going back to the 1940s in Texas when the Army first established forts in the region. Then Texas took over, and that was not as and then the Civil War intervened, and there really wasn't a lot of continuous weather records until the 1890s when the federal government established a program for cooperative weather observations where citizens voluntarily took observations. So we regard the start of modern weather records as about 1895.
Okay.
There's about 8,000 cooperative stations across the United States. About 1,000 of those are designated United States Historical Climate Network stations, which have especially long records. And the numbers I refer to for changes in temperature in Texas involve essentially the 40 or so long-term stations that are distributed around the state.
But is the temperature, even though those stations may be historical in nature, obviously the method in calculating the temperature and determining the temperature, the instrumentation and what have you is different. Would you talk a little bit about maybe what margin of error might be historically? Because I'm guessing they use mercury thermometers or what have you, and how they calculate it versus probably more digital readings now. Yeah,
the instrumentation has changed quite a bit. We went from what's called the Cotton Region shelter with mercury thermometers inside. About in the 1990s, there was a switch over to electronic thermometers, and that also caused a lot of station moves as stations got close to buildings and so forth. Of course, as time goes on, you get trees growing, you have a variety of things happening to individual stations. To at least partially compensate for that, the National Climatic Data Center checks for changes in temperature at a particular location compared to surroundings whenever there's a documented change in the location or conditions of measurement, and they adjust based upon what sort of discontinuity there was there. They also look for undocumented changes by when there's a large difference at one station that doesn't occur at others and adjust for that. So there's no absolute temperature record that's 100% certain. So it all represents the best guess based upon the analysis of the data available.
Okay.
This also represents, we talk about temperature anomalies rather than temperatures usually because, especially in West Texas, temperature changes quite a bit from location to location between the valley and a mountaintop. But the variation from year to year is a lot more consistent over a large area, and so we can get by with fewer thermometers measuring changes than it would take to actually measure the exact average temperature across the state.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so back to regarding drought, I think the best single thing that can be done for Texas, and especially the Texas industry, is ensuring that Texas will always have a worry-free, stable water and energy supply. And doing so requires consideration of the possibilities of climate change along with population expansion and economic growth, which are the main drivers for water planning presently. The climate change outlook for Texas precipitation is unclear, partly because Texas is located somewhere along the dividing line between precipitation increases to our north that are projected and projected precipitation decreases to our south. In the northern United States and Canada, precipitation is likely to continue increasing because of climate change. Meanwhile, in Mexico, most models project a substantial decrease of precipitation combined with an increase of temperature. And that effective double whammy for our neighbor to the south has several important implications for Texas. First, the increasingly dry conditions in Mexico will put increasing stress on the international agreements that govern water supplies and deliveries along our shared river, the Rio Grande. A large portion of the water that flows into Amistad and Falcon reservoirs presently falls on the Mexican side of the border and is left over after what Mexico uses for irrigation. Secondly, the reduced viability of agriculture in Mexico, especially at the individual farmer level, combined with possible water supply limitations on Mexican industrial expansion, will increase the impetus for immigration from Mexico into the United States. If Texas attains water security, not just with the drought of the 1950s as benchmark, but with the droughts of the future as benchmarks, Texas can attract industry that otherwise would have to set up shop in less resilient areas. Meanwhile, efforts to control the spread of tropical diseases into Texas may have to be ramped up as the climate of Texas potentially becomes more hospitable to tropical environment pathogens. This concern applies to human health as well as diseases of livestock and crops. Another important aspect of Texas international trade is its ports. Sea level continues to increase, and in Texas, the rate of sea level rise is relatively severe because the global rise is combined with an even larger local effect from land subsidence. This is fortunately a slow-moving problem, and even though sea level rise is expected to speed up, there will be ample time to adjust the major ports of Texas to the changing sea level, especially if new infrastructure is designed with the necessary flexibility. Finally, adapting to climate change involves not just changes in the climate system, but possible changes in the policy and regulatory system in response to climate change. Just as Texas has little control over climate change itself, Texas has little control over actions taken by Washington and internationally to deal with climate change. We're beginning to experience this through the EPA's regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. The best way to hedge against unknown future greenhouse gas regulations is to develop a statewide portfolio of diverse energy sources. Just as Texas has profited from being a technological leader in fossil fuel exploration and recovery, Texas should position itself to benefit from an inevitable shift away from fossil fuels. Natural gas is the cleanest fossil fuel, and the boom in exploration and recovery has allowed natural gas to displace coal as the preferred fuel for power generation in Texas. Texas should consider whether to plan on making natural gas a transitional fuel on the road to development of greater non-fossil fuel energy sources, or whether we prefer to return to the regulation-susceptible use of coal as our dominant energy source. In another decade or two, we'll have a better handle on how much climate change to expect. In the meantime, investments in climate resiliency and preparations for changes in climate that are already very likely will be valuable hedges against the future. Thank you again. I'll be happy to answer any other questions you have.
Thank you. Members, any questions? Chairman Nevares?
What's causing sea levels to speed up in terms of them rising?
The acceleration of sea level would be caused by two possibilities. First, acceleration in the rate of temperature increase would lead to acceleration of sea level rise through melting of glaciers and ice caps. Secondly, there's the danger of destabilization of some ice that's presently locked on land, such as parts of the West Antarctic ice sheet. As the oceans warm and the sea, the ice melts from below, its locking onto the land can break and effectively accelerate the flow of ice into the sea, which promotes increased melting and increased rise.